Olá, seja bem-vindo. É um prazer estar aqui novamente para mais um episódio da série Impertinente da Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos, programa dedicado a entrevistas com grandes personalidades da política, economia e sociedade. Hoje vamos falar num dos temas mais quentes de 2021 e que promete sê-lo também em 2022, o Afeganistão. Vamos fazê-lo com uma das mais conceituadas personalidades ligadas ao tema, um historiador, antropólogo, que conhece muito bem esta região, que há vários anos que investiga o Afeganistão. É Thomas Barfield, presidente do American Institute for Afghan Studies. Começou nos anos 70 a fazer estudos antropólogos no país, que conhece como poucos. Vamos falar sobre o contexto do Afeganistão, dar um bocadinho a história de tudo aquilo que tem acontecido e porque é sempre um território tão conturbado, com tanto conflito e um território tão disputado. E vamos falar na ocupação norte-americana. E em que estado é que o país se encontra neste momento sob a liderança dos talibãs? Vamos começar a conversa com o Thomas, que está em Boston, nos Estados Unidos. Thomas Barfield, a pleasure to have an opportunity to speak with you about this hot topic, really, one of the top political issues in 2021. We think it's going to be, again, very much on the top of the news agenda in 2022. And before we get into the current state of affairs, I wanted to ask you to give our viewers a little bit of a context of why has Afghanistan been for so many years, for decades, such a territory of conflict, of turbulence, and why it's so susceptible, really, for coups and takeovers.
Well, thank you for having me. Afghanistan has been in the news and has seemed to be ungovernable for the past 40 years. But in fact, if we look at the past century, Afghanistan was largely at peace and stable for almost a century until 1978. And that's when a communist regime took over. Insurgencies began, the Soviets invaded, the Soviets left, there was a civil war, the Taliban rose, the Americans came in, the Taliban came back, and the Americans left. So for the past 40 years, Afghanistan has experienced one of the worst situations of turmoil in the world, less as a result of coups and more as a result of governments there collapsing and creating vacuums.
That was actually an incredible, effective way of summarizing so many years of history, and there have been so many highs and lows over the last 40 years. Now that the Taliban is back, we'll talk about them and how they're doing and what they're trying to do as well, and the challenges that they face. But why is this particular region so important to world politics?
Well, the interesting thing is it's remained important to world politics almost for 175 years, but for very different reasons. During the colonial period, it was the buffer zone between British India and Tsarist Russia. That was known as the Great Game. That led to two Anglo-Afghan wars in the 19th century. And then it sort of dropped off the world stage for a while, although at the end of the First World War, when the Afghans declared their independence, they were the only independent Muslim state in the world after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. But then they became important again in the 1930s because they began taking aid from Nazi Germany, since that country was opposed to the Soviet Union and the British. World War II broke out, but the Afghans remained neutral. But at the end of the war, they found themselves in the Cold War competition between the Soviet Union and the United States. That was not a hot conflict. That was not a military conflict. It was a Cold War conflict in which both countries poured money into Afghanistan to prove that their systems were better. So the Soviets built the military, the Americans built the education system, both sides built the roads, but suddenly Afghanistan in the middle of nowhere was seen as a litmus test for both systems. Then when a Soviet-backed party took power, the Soviet Union felt it had an obligation to protect it, even if it was falling apart, led to a Soviet invasion. So at that point, it became a hot war, one of the few ones in the Cold War. And the Americans looked upon it as Russia's Vietnam, and they were going to help them suffer as much as possible. They didn't care about the Afghans. They did care about trouble with the Soviet Union. Once the Soviet Union left, once the Soviet Union dissolved, the Americans said, we will never be back there again. They pulled out all aid, they pulled out all interest, because they said, what kind of a remote place like that could ever cause us any trouble? And then 9/11 came. And suddenly Afghanistan was the center of a new kind of geopolitical struggle, a question of multinational terrorist groups that had worldwide ambitions. That caused the Americans to go in, and then it became an American project of state building. So the irony is Afghanistan has remained incredibly important in world geopolitics, even as the issues of those geopolitics has changed.
We'll talk about the American occupation in a moment, but I really wanted to look at, in your opinion, the country's state of affairs at the moment. The Taliban are back. How are they doing since they took over, and what are the main challenges for their government and for the Afghan people in leading with the new government?
The Taliban's main problem right now is they occupy the country, they control the country, but they've never understood how to be a government. Even during the Civil War, when the Taliban would capture territory in Afghanistan, the government in Kabul would continue to pay the teachers there, would continue to pay the doctors and clinic supervisors. In other words, the Afghan government, supported by the Americans, paid for governance within Taliban territory. Once the Taliban took over, they actually had no idea how to run a government or what a government should do. So in some senses, there's an irony that they have complete military control over the entire country, but have not yet figured out what to do with it.
What does the Taliban need to do to be able to provide a stable governing structure, having taken over, like you said, from a military perspective and not being able to govern the country? What's missing at the moment?
Well, what's missing is money.
Right.
You have to remember that as of last year, the World Bank said that something like 47% or 42% of Afghanistan's entire GDP was based on foreign aid. That's huge. The Americans paid for 75% of the government. The World Bank paid for the medical system. All of that disappeared in a blink of an eye. But it's also important to realize that no Afghan government, at least going back 175 years, has ever been self-supporting. Afghan governments are stable only to the extent they find an outside power to subsidize them. So the Taliban desperately need some subsidies, because even if they were effective at collecting tax money, even if they were fine governors, they wouldn't have enough revenue. And in the past, governments have been dependent on this last one, on the Americans. When the communist government, they were dependent upon the Soviets. Earlier monarchs depended on subsidies from the British. Whenever Afghanistan lacked outside aid, outside subsidies, that's when we see its governments collapse. And I think the Taliban are aware of that. But the problem is they're not willing to make the moves that you would need to essentially get the countries they just defeated to come back to Afghanistan to pay for the public services under a regime that they really despise.
Now, I've read reports of the threat of mass starvation. We know how tough the winters there can be. That's approaching. How dramatic is the situation right now for the Afghan citizens?
I would say it's extremely dramatic, because even before the Taliban took power, civil servants hadn't been paid for 3 months. And prices began rising. But with the Taliban coming in, and during a period, this has been a very bad drought year in Afghanistan. The harvests are way down. So even in areas where people largely are normally immune to what goes on in Kabul because they're subsistence farmers, they grow what they need, they don't have enough. So there's the real danger of famine in Afghanistan, because so much of the country, even last year, the UN was saying they would need a massive relief effort. to prevent hunger and starvation in Afghanistan. Now the problem is much worse. So yeah, there is an enormous threat of a humanitarian crisis there.
How much is the Taliban government aware of this, and is there something they can do to recoup some of the foreign aid that they lost? Is that a diplomatic game? Is that a political game? Is that a military game they have to play?
It's a game that they should play. They need it, and some factions of the Taliban absolutely recognize this. But you have to realize the Taliban don't have a singular leader. If you ask me, who is the Taliban leader? I couldn't even tell you. In the 90s, it was Mullah Omar, for better or worse. But just who the Taliban leader is now, who gives the orders, who makes the decisions, is not clear. And the Taliban have factions. One of the major leaders of the Taliban last week went on radio, he doesn't like to appear on TV, and announced it was not the Taliban's responsibility to feed the Afghan people. That was God's responsibility, so they should pray. That's not a very good, probably, prospect for avoiding famine in Afghanistan. But that is the view of at least some Taliban who have this sort of pre-modern idea of a state, that a state doesn't provide social services. It has an army, it has a legal system, it protects the country from the outside, it collects the taxes. We have to remember a modern state, most of its revenue goes to redistributing food, money, to particularly its poor citizens. It has pensions. The Taliban are in this pre-modern state is, we don't have to provide that. All we have to do is provide justice and security. Let the people find their own food. And that really doesn't fly in the modern era, particularly not in Afghanistan, which has 20 years of being developed on the line of much more of, if you will, a kind of a welfare state, even though it is a poor country.
Let's talk about the dynamics that exist in the country when it comes to influence on government and opposition to the Taliban that have just only really been back in power for a few months. With citizens becoming desperate, could there be a threat of that Taliban government being overturned? What's the resistance like there? What are the militias like? What's happening regarding the stability or not, or the turbulence around the decision making and the power structure?
Right now, it appears to be stable, in part because Pakistan helped to intervene to sort of wipe out the remnants of the last government who were trying to set up a military resistance in the Panjshir Valley. So in some senses, the Taliban appear militarily control the whole country. You don't see active militias, but you have to remember how many tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of men were trained in arms, many of whom took their weapons home. They are not opposing the Taliban now, and there's certainly, I would say, no organized resistance to them. But this is actually very similar to the situation when the communists took power in 1978. Suddenly, trouble began appearing all over the country. It wasn't coordinated, and they weren't able to handle it. That's why they called in the Soviet Union. This could be the same kind of thing. Right now, the Taliban are in power, so why challenge them? But people are waiting. What if the Taliban begin taking food from villages that don't have it, saying you owe it in taxes? What if they go in saying, we're the victors, we're going to tell you what to do, and people start shooting back? That could be a problem. And the more problems that break out, then the more people in Afghanistan think, well, maybe the Taliban aren't in charge of this country. And particularly if the Taliban split into factions between the Taliban who come from the south in Kandahar and those who come from the east that are more connected with Pakistan. So the biggest problem, however, I would say, is not necessarily to look at the rural areas, the countryside, but to look at the cities that for 20 years have developed a culture, ideologies entirely opposed to the Taliban. And you have to remember Afghanistan's population, 75% of the population is under the age of 25.
Wow.
It's a very young population, one of the youngest populations in the world. And that means you've got young people whose futures have just been turned upside down, who are in turmoil. Right now, they're waiting and watching. Well, what happens if the cities revolt? And when people ask me, what would that look like? I tell them, look at Syria, where, again, an Assad regime that had tremendous military power, a tremendous security apparatus, found itself losing control of city after city because an urban insurgency is much more difficult to deal with than a rural one. That potentially could happen in Afghanistan. Hasn't happened, but if people get pushed and it turns to violence, and the Taliban thinks, well, we'll just respond with violence, we'll show who's tougher, it could quickly spiral out of control.
You mentioned the young demographics there, and obviously there's a worry for that age group and the possibilities they could have for their life and lifestyle, especially after 20 years of an American occupation where there were more civil liberties. What does this mean especially for women and their possibilities to be integrated into society?
Oh, the Taliban don't want to see them integrated into society other than as mothers and wives. I mean, that's fundamental difference. And they essentially seen their opportunities crushed. But unlike in the 1990s, when the Taliban had similar policies, in the 1990s, they were dealing with cities that had been turned into rubble, where anarchy was reigning, and anybody that could end it was, well, give them a chance. Now they're dealing with a much more educated population and a population that's much more hooked into the world. I couldn't even find a landline telephone when I worked in Afghanistan in the 1970s. Maybe there were a couple in government offices. Even the nomads that I worked with occasionally call me on their cell phones. Every Afghan I know has a cell phone. Internet is very big. Afghanistan and what the Taliban are doing cannot be cut off from the world the way it was done in the past. Also, in this case, there's a much larger Afghan diaspora that's liable to play a role. The Afghan diaspora during the Soviet period was very small, but this one is much larger and more influential. So the belief that they'll simply accept this, I'm not so sure that's the case. The Taliban are assuming it, but they're dealing with a population that has very different needs and attitudes. The fact that you've seen women demonstrate in Kabul on the streets, that's certainly taken the Taliban by surprise.
I'm sure. Obviously, the Taliban are in power after the Americans withdrew their troops and the international forces left overall. I think most people around the world, including myself, were surprised of how quickly the Taliban returned to power, how quickly the previous government crumbled. But you weren't.
No, because this is the fourth regime in which Kabul has fallen without a fight. The communist regime collapsed in 1992 because when the Soviet Union disappeared, it didn't have a patron. And even though their army was intact, they had weapons. Rather than fight for Kabul, they turned power over to the Mujahideen. The Northern Alliance, the Mujahideen, fled Kabul rather than fight the Taliban in the mid-90s when they took over. But the most telling thing compared to this withdrawal is almost exactly 20 years ago, Mullah Omar swore that if the Americans came in, the Taliban and all Afghans would unite against them. And 10 weeks later, Mullah Omar was asking the question, where's the Taliban army? Where are the Afghan people? As his government collapsed around him without barely fighting a shot. And certainly Kabul was taken without firing a shot. So when this government collapsed, it was essentially for the same reason. With an international patron gone and their president fleeing without even telling his military or his cabinet, the belief was this old regime is gone and there's a vacuum. So it's less a Taliban victory than being sucked into a vacuum created by a collapse of the existing government. And that's usually what's happened in Afghanistan. Of course, the new side always claims it's a victory. God is on our side. But if you look at it, they sweep in because there's nobody to stop them.
We know how much criticism Joe Biden faced from the international community for the way in which he managed the retreat, the withdrawal of the troops. In your opinion, was that criticism justified? And how much was his administration to blame in comparison to the Trump administration who actually signed the deal?
He deserves a lot of the blame. This was a presidential decision. Um, in the United States, the military, the State Department, outside advisors all said this will lead to chaos. This will lead to a collapse. And you have to remember that Afghanistan, unlike Iraq, has never been a political issue in Afghanistan. It is remarkably one of the few conflicts in Afghanistan that does not divide on Republican and Democrat lines. It's really amazing. So there was no internal political pressure to pull out. It was his decision. And to say, I'm going to end forever wars, well, is he going to pull out of Korea next? That's been a forever war for more than 70 years. I mean, it's his decision. But I got to say that his decision was based on the deal that Trump put together, which was done without the consultation of the Afghan government and was essentially a withdrawal agreement that we are getting out and asking the Taliban to be nice. Biden said, well, Trump had signed that, so I had to follow it through. I don't notice Biden saying that about any other issue that Trump did. He was under absolutely no obligation to do that. He could blame it on Trump, but I have to say that if my eyes were closed and I had seen that withdrawal on TV and the chaos, I would have assumed Donald Trump was in power. That was the most Trumpian withdrawal that I could imagine, which is, I think, one of the reasons that Biden got so much criticism. Because if you were going to withdraw, there were ways to do it orderly. And in fact, this is the fourth foreign invasion of Afghanistan. Both the British and the Soviets withdrew and left a stable government behind. Okay, there was even a template for doing that. Biden didn't bother to look at history for that.
It was indeed tragic, and I mean, I think all of us will remember for years to come the pictures we saw, the video footage we saw of the packed planes of people fighting to get on the last means of transportation to leave the country. It was truly traumatic and continues to be for the people who are there. Now the Americans are gone, at least regarding their presence in the country. Let's talk a little bit about what other foreign influence this country could be subjected to. You mentioned Pakistan. What is the role of Pakistan, of China, of Russia, of even Al Qaeda, the Islamic State? I mean, there's so many. There's so many issues that Afghanistan could be susceptible to and be influenced by. How do you see the landscape now and foreign interest in the region?
Well, in some senses, it could be said that for 20 years, America was making Afghanistan safe for Chinese investment. I mean, for all the people who said the United States invaded for oil or for minerals and this or that, fact is no Western countries, EU or US, seem to be interested in any of those resources. China and India were. So if we're looking at it now that the US is gone, it's now a regional problem. For Pakistan, its intelligence agency is doing a victory lap. Its guys won. But at the same time, it's emboldened the very parties in in Pakistan that want to see the overthrow of the Islamic government. So if you're thinking about doing a jihad, Pakistan could have a sorcerer's apprentice problem. Pakistan's a much more nuclear power, close to 200 million people. That is a much better target. Afghanistan makes a good base for a much better target. For China, it's a bit of a nightmare. China is already being condemned for its policies in Xinjiang against the Uyghurs, and particularly its concern of trying to eradicate Uyghurs' Muslim Islamic belief. If they are doing that to world blame for essentially a people that have not done insurgencies, that actually practice a very orthodox form of Islam, what do they think about having to deal with a government that actually does see and want the overthrow of countries so that they can install their own Islamic systems? That's a very dangerous group. And in particular, they could become a base for Uyghurs or others to go against China. Central Asia is also worried about that. So for the region, they live there. particularly if you're in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. Some of the allies of the Taliban have been the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, who want to bring the Taliban system to Central Asia. China has to worry about that. So all the neighbors do, including Iran, because a radical Sunni regime has a history of not treating its Shia population well. And Iran sees itself as the protector, if you will, of Shias in central Afghanistan and elsewhere. It was easy to ally with the Taliban as long as both Iran and the Taliban had America as its enemy. Now that it's not, we can see the differences between them. So in some sense, it's made it more difficult for the countries in the region, and even Pakistan. It's got a victory, but Pakistan is bankrupt. It cannot pay for a Taliban army, for a Taliban government. It could act as a sufficient patron for an insurgency, but it has enough problems of its own without taking on the problems of Afghanistan. So suddenly, in the region, Afghanistan is now their problem. Ideally, this would put their heads together and they would say, how can we restore stability in Afghanistan? But unfortunately, Pakistan has always been the odd man out on that because of its long periods of hostility with India. So we've got some difficulties there. But it also means now that there are factions in Afghanistan, it's relatively cheap for, let's say, Iran to send some of the militias that it recruited from Afghan expatriates that have fought in Syria. There are many Afghans, fled to Iran during the Soviet and Civil War period. Many of them were Shia. The Iranian government has recruited a lot of those people to fight as militias in Syria. It could send those people back. Similarly, you have a lot of people in other parts of the country that are armed. They were trained by the Americans and might decide we're going to defend our own region. So what we've got is a need for the region to put things together because they're the ones that really suffer from this. If terrorism begins to break out, India is liable to be one of the first victims. So everybody's in the region has to have concern about the Taliban's sort of inability to bring stability and what are their goals, particularly since they never cease their links with Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups. The Taliban have no particular interest in jihad, Islam, terrorism outside of their own country, but their allies certainly do.
We've talked about the history, the context, the current state of affairs, internal and external influences on the country. Final question, Thomas, is if I asked you to look into your magic crystal ball that I'm sure you have in front of you and try to predict what could happen over the next 6 to 9 to 12 months in the country, in a summary point of view, how would you expect the country to deal with all its challenges over the next year?
Unfortunately, I'm worried that things will get worse with an economic crisis that turns into a military one, particularly if there's an urban insurgency, but also if there is a tremendous economic crisis. I would be particularly concerned in the EU about millions of Afghans that have not only lost their sort of life chances, but are worried about feeding themselves and their families. Could we see a huge refugee flow? This time, not out of sort of, maybe I can make a better living in the EU than I can in Afghanistan, but truly out of desperation. That if it becomes a country that's impossible to live in, at which point that would affect the neighbors. Pakistan is not letting refugees in. Central Asia is not letting refugees in. Well, when people are desperate, you're not going to be able to stop them. And so from a world point of view, stabilizing this is very important because problems that start in Afghanistan tend not to remain in Afghanistan.
Thomas, it's been an absolute pleasure to discuss this topic with you. To close out the show, I'm going to ask you a few quick-fire questions, which we ask all our guests and obviously adapted to the topics that they're focusing on. So for these questions, either one word or one sentence, please, as an answer. First one, If there was one piece of advice you would give the Taliban government on how to rule the country, what would that be?
Is don't assume that your absolute victory gives you the right to tell everyone what to do. When you have won an absolute victory, it's the time to reconcile with your enemies, to bring them in, to make them part of your regime. That will make it stable. Regimes that fail to do that generally collapse.
In one word or sentence, how would you describe the American withdrawal from Afghanistan?
Chaotic.
From your experience, what's one personality trait that a good leader should have?
A good leader should have his or her own political interest aligned with those of the people he or she rules.
What's the biggest challenge that the Afghan people face over the next decade?
The biggest challenge the Afghan people face over the next decade is actually getting a government that doesn't come from the extremes. The Afghans are remarkably good at cobbling together their own agreements on how to live peacefully. But they've had communists, they've had Islamists, they've had invasions, and to some extent, what they need is an opportunity to settle things among themselves without outside interference.
Thomas Barfield, thank you so much for your time. We've all become more educated on this crucial subject in world politics. All the best, and our wishes of a happy new 2022 to you and your family.
And thank you all.
Foi mais programa de Impertinente, uma conversa fascinante com Thomas Barfield sobre este tema quente, o Afeganistão, que continuará a ser em 2022. Fechamos aqui este episódio da nossa série e já sabe, quando há factos, há argumentos. Até breve.